I raised my daughter for 28 years. I taught her to ride a bike, walked her to school every morning, and worked 2 jobs to pay for her wedding. But when her fiancé told her to choose between him and me, she didn't even hesitate. She looked me in the eyes and said, "Dad, I think it's time for you to leave." That was 6 months ago. She hasn't called once, and yesterday I found out why he really wanted me gone. Before we continue, please like this video and subscribe. Your support means everything. I raised my daughter for 28 years. I taught her to ride a bike, walked her to school every morning, and worked 2 jobs to pay for her wedding. But when her fiancé told her to choose between him and me, she didn't even hesitate. She looked me in the eyes and said, "Dad, I think it's time for you to leave." That was 6 months ago. She hasn't called once. And yesterday, I found out why he really wanted me gone. If you've ever felt abandoned by someone you'd die for, please like this video and subscribe. Your support means everything to me right now. I need to tell you about David, my daughter Sarah's fiancé. When she first brought him home 2 years ago, I wanted to like him. I really did. You have to understand, Sarah was my whole world after her mother passed. It had been just the two of us for 16 years, and I'd always known that someday she'd find someone special. I wanted to be happy for her. David had this confident smile and firm handshake, the kind that makes fathers think their little girl found someone strong. He was tall, well-dressed, spoke with authority about his job in finance. When he looked you in the eye, he seemed sincere, trustworthy, the kind of man who could take care of my daughter the way I'd been doing since she was 12 years old. But there were small things that bothered me from the very beginning. Little things that didn't seem important at the time, but looking back now, they were signs I should have recognized. The way he'd interrupt Sarah mid-sentence. She'd be telling a story about work or something funny that happened during her day, and David would cut her off to add his own commentary or redirect the conversation entirely. Sarah would just stop talking. She'd smile apologetically and let him take over. Or how he'd change the subject whenever she mentioned childhood memories with me. Sarah loved telling stories about our adventures, the camping trips we took every summer, the time I taught her to drive stick shift in an empty parking lot, how we'd stay up late watching old movies after her mother died because neither of us could sleep. But whenever she'd start one of these stories around David, he'd suddenly remember something urgent about work, or he'd suggest they should get going, or he'd launch into a story about his own family that somehow always seemed more important. I told myself I was being overprotective. What father isn't a little suspicious of the first serious boyfriend? Sarah seemed happy, and that's all that mattered, right? When David was around, she'd light up in a way I hadn't seen since before her mother got sick. She'd hang on his every word, like he was some kind of prophet, laughing at jokes that weren't particularly funny, agreeing with opinions she'd never expressed before. I'd raised Sarah to be independent and strong. After her mother died, she'd had to grow up faster than most kids. She learned to do her own laundry at 13, could cook a decent dinner by 14, and by the time she graduated high school, she was more capable than most adults I knew. But around David, she became smaller somehow, more apologetic, like she was constantly seeking his approval. When I'd mention it gently, just asking if everything was okay or suggesting that maybe she didn't need to check with David before making simple decisions, she'd get defensive immediately. "You don't understand our relationship, Dad," she'd say, that edge creeping into her voice that I'd never heard before. "David and I are partners. We make decisions together." But they weren't making decisions together. David was making decisions, and Sarah was agreeing with them. There's a difference, though I didn't know how to explain that to her without sounding like the overprotective father she was already accusing me of being. The engagement happened fast, 8 months after they met. I remember the day Sarah called me at work, breathless with excitement. "Dad, he proposed. We're getting married next spring." I was standing in the middle of a construction site, surrounded by the noise of hammers and saws, and suddenly everything went quiet. I should have been thrilled. I should have been congratulating her, asking about the ring, demanding to know all the details. Instead, I felt this knot forming in my stomach that I couldn't explain. That's wonderful, sweetheart," I managed to say. "I'm so happy for you." And I was happy for her, or I wanted to be, but something felt wrong about the timing, about the way it had all happened so quickly. 8 months wasn't very long to know someone well enough to spend your life with them. "Can I take you both to dinner this weekend to celebrate?" I asked. "Somewhere nice. My treat. There was a pause, and then I heard David's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. "Oh, Dad, that's so sweet," Sarah said, but her voice had changed, less excited, more careful. "But David wants to take me to meet his parents this weekend. They're driving down from Portland specifically to celebrate with us." "Of course," I said. "What about next weekend, then?" Another pause, another muffled conversation. "Actually, David thinks it would be better if we did something with both families together. You know, so Ryan can get to know each other." David got on the phone then, his voice warm and friendly. "Hey, Mr. Peterson, sorry to steal the phone, but I wanted to thank you personally for raising such an incredible daughter. We're really excited to start planning the wedding, and we definitely want you to be involved in everything." The words were right, but something about his tone felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced this conversation. "We've already made plans with my family for this weekend," he continued, "but we'll definitely set something up soon where everyone can meet. Sarah's told me so much about you." That was the first time I felt truly left out. Not angry, exactly, but displaced. Like I was suddenly on the outside of my daughter's life looking in, asking permission to celebrate her engagement instead of being the first person she wanted to share it with. But I pushed those feelings down. I convinced myself that this was how it was supposed to work. Marriage meant Sarah would naturally become closer to David's family. That was normal, healthy even. I told myself that David was trying to include me, that he was being respectful by wanting both families to meet. I even started planning how I could help pay for the wedding. Sarah didn't know it yet, but I'd been saving money for years, hoping someday I'd be able to give her the perfect wedding day. I thought that maybe if I showed David how much I loved Sarah, how willing I was to support their future together, he'd make more of an effort to include me in their lives. I had no idea that I was already being slowly erased from my own daughter's life. That every conversation, every decision, every plan was being filtered through David first. That the man I was trying so hard to accept had already decided there wasn't room for both of us in Sarah's future. Looking back now, I can see that David never intended to join our family. From the very beginning, his plan was to extract Sarah from it, and I was so focused on wanting to like him, so determined to be the supportive father who trusted his daughter's judgment, that I missed every single warning sign until it was too late. The wedding planning should have been one of the happiest times of my life. I'd been dreaming about walking Sarah down the aisle since she was born. When she was little, she used to put on her mother's old white slip and practice walking slowly through the house, carrying a bouquet of dandelions she'd picked from our yard. She'd make me stand at the end of the hallway and wait for her, and when she reached me, she'd always say the same thing. "Someday we'll do this for real, Daddy." After her mother passed when Sarah was 12, those dreams became even more precious to me. I knew that Sarah's wedding day would be bittersweet. Her mother wouldn't be there to help her get dressed or to cry during the ceremony. But I thought it would also be beautiful, a chance for Sarah and me to honor her mother's memory while celebrating the beginning of Sarah's new life. I thought planning her wedding would be our special time together, father and daughter, making memories and decisions that would matter for the rest of our lives. Instead, every single conversation about the wedding included David's input, David's preferences, David's family's traditions. It wasn't that Sarah didn't want my opinion, it was that my opinion stopped mattering the moment it conflicted with what David wanted. The first real argument came when we were discussing venues. I suggested St. Mary's, the church where Sarah was baptized and where her mother and I had been married. It was a beautiful old building with stained glass windows that caught the afternoon light just perfectly. Sarah had always loved that church. "Oh, Dad," Sarah said, glancing at David before continuing. "We've actually been looking at more modern venues. David thinks St. Mary's is too traditional." David nodded, putting his arm around Sarah's shoulders. "No offense, Mr. Peterson, but we're looking for something that reflects who we are as a couple, something more contemporary, more us." "But Sarah's always loved St. Mary's," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Remember when you were little, how you used to say you wanted to get married there, just like Mom and I did?" Sarah looked uncomfortable. "People change, Dad. I was just a kid then." The way she said it made it sound like her childhood dreams were something embarrassing she'd outgrown, rather than precious memories we'd shared. David squeezed her shoulder and smiled at me like he was being patient with a difficult child. "We're actually looking at this amazing modern venue downtown," he said. "Floor-to-ceiling windows, very contemporary aesthetic, much better for photography." That became the pattern for every decision. When I offered to pay for the flowers, Sarah's favorite white roses, the kind her mother had carried, David had already chosen some exotic orchids because they photographed better and made more of a statement. When I suggested the band that had played at our neighborhood block parties for years, the one Sarah had danced to as a child, David had already booked a DJ who specialized in modern reception music. Every suggestion I made was politely dismissed, usually with some explanation about what was better for photos or more contemporary or more sophisticated. It was like David was systematically erasing not just my preferences, but any connection the wedding might have to Sarah's life before him. The breaking point came when we were discussing the father-daughter dance. I'd been secretly taking dance lessons at the community center, learning new steps because I wanted to surprise Sarah. But more importantly, I'd been practicing to Butterfly Kisses, the song I used to sing to her when she was little. When Sarah was born, I'd rock her to sleep every night singing that song. As she got older, I'd sing it to her when she was scared or sad or just needed comfort. When she was learning to dance as a teenager, she'd put her feet on top of mine, and we'd sway around the living room to that song. And she'd always promise me that someday, when she got married, we'd dance to it at her wedding. "I've been thinking about our dance," I said during one of our wedding planning sessions. "What about butterfly kisses? I know it might seem a little old-fashioned, but—" David laughed, actually laughed, like I'd just suggested something ridiculous. "That's a bit cheesy, don't you think?" he said, not even looking at me. "We've already picked something more contemporary, more sophisticated." I looked at Sarah, waiting for her to remember our promise, waiting for her to defend the song that had meant so much to both of us. Instead, she nodded and said, "David's right, Dad. We want something more modern." She couldn't even meet my eyes when she said it. That night, I sat in my living room looking at photos of Sarah as a little girl. There she was, at age 3, standing on my feet as we danced in the kitchen. Age 7, after her first recital, still in her little pink tutu. Age 10, the last birthday before her mother got sick, blowing out candles while I sang Happy Birthday in the background. I remembered teaching her to dance, her tiny feet on top of mine as we swayed to that old song. I remembered her promising me that someday, when she got married, we'd dance to it at her wedding. I remembered how safe and loved she'd felt in my arms, how she'd giggle when I'd spin her around, how she'd always ask me to sing just one more time before bedtime. Now she couldn't even meet my eyes when she took that promise away. But it wasn't just the song, it was everything. The venue, the flowers, the music, the food. Every detail was being chosen by David or David's family. Sarah had become a passive participant in her own wedding planning, agreeing to decisions that had nothing to do with who she was or what she'd always dreamed of. I started to realize that every tradition, every memory, every piece of our shared history was being systematically replaced with David's vision of what a wedding should be. The church where her mother and I were married was too old-fashioned. The songs that had soundtracked her childhood were too cheesy. The flowers that represented our family's love story weren't sophisticated enough. I wasn't losing my daughter to marriage. I was losing her to someone who was rewriting our entire relationship, someone who was convinced that Sarah's life had only really begun when she met him, and everything that came before was just something to be improved upon or discarded entirely. And the worst part? Sarah was letting him do it. The strong, independent young woman I'd raised was disappearing, replaced by someone who apologized for her own preferences and deferred to David's judgment on everything from the color of the napkins to the style of her wedding dress. I tried to talk to her about it once, gently suggesting that maybe some of our family traditions could be incorporated into the ceremony. She got that defensive look I'd started to recognize. "Dad, you have to understand that this isn't just about what I want anymore. David and I are starting a new family together. We need to create our own traditions." But they weren't creating anything together. David was creating, and Sarah was agreeing. And somehow, in the process, everything that had made Sarah who she was, her history, her memories, her connection to the people who had loved her longest, was being labeled as something that needed to be left behind. The wedding was still 6 months away, but I could already feel myself becoming a stranger at my own daughter's celebration. A guest who was expected to smile and write a check and be grateful for whatever small role I was allowed to play in the life I'd spent 28 years building with her. The changes happened so gradually that I almost didn't notice them at first. That's how the most devastating betrayals work. Not with a single dramatic moment, but with 1,000 tiny cuts that you don't realize are bleeding until you're already dying from them. Sarah used to call me every Sunday evening. It had been our ritual for years, starting when she went away to college. No matter what was happening in her life, exams, boyfriends, job stress, friend drama, Sunday at 7 o'clock, my phone would ring. We'd talk for an hour, sometimes longer. She'd tell me about her week, her job, little things that reminded her of funny stories from when she was growing up. I'd update her on what was happening in the neighborhood, share gossip about people we both knew, ask her advice about decisions I was making. Those calls were the highlight of my week, the thread that kept us connected even when life got busy. But after David came into the picture, those calls started getting shorter. What used to be hour-long conversations became 30-minute check-ins, then 20 minutes, then just long enough for Sarah to confirm that yes, she was fine, yes, work was good, yes, she'd talk to me soon. Then they became every other week. Sarah would apologize. She was so busy with David, they had plans with his friends. She was meeting his parents for dinner. Always some obligation related to David's life that took precedence over our Sunday tradition. Then once a month, then sporadically, whenever Sarah remembered or felt guilty enough to pick up the phone. When I'd call her instead, David would often answer. His voice would be friendly but firm. Sarah was in the shower, or she was taking a nap, or she was busy with something important. But he'd let her know I called, and she'd call me back soon. She rarely called back. Family dinners became another casualty. For years, Sarah would come over every other Saturday. We'd stop at the grocery store together, pick out ingredients, and then cook together in the kitchen, where I'd taught her to make her mother's recipes. Spaghetti sauce with extra garlic, the way her mom used to make it. Chocolate chip cookies with slightly too much vanilla, because that's how Sarah liked them best. We'd cook and talk and laugh, and she'd tell me about her life, her coworkers, her friends, her dreams for the future. Those Saturday dinners were sacred time, just the two of us carrying on traditions that connected us to her mother and to each other. But once David came into the picture, those dinners started including him, which was fine at first. I wanted to get to know him, and I wanted him to feel welcome in our family. But slowly, the location started changing. Instead of cooking at home, we'd go to restaurants where David felt more comfortable. Instead of making her mother's recipes, we'd try new places that David wanted to experience. Then the dinners moved to David's parents' house, where I was invited as a guest rather than the host, where I sat at someone else's table, eating someone else's food, listening to someone else's stories, while my daughter smiled and nodded and acted like this was perfectly normal. I watched my role in Sarah's life shift from father to acquaintance. David's father became her confidant for career advice. Apparently, his experience in business made him more qualified to guide her than the man who'd been supporting her ambitions since she was old enough to have them. David's mother became her shopping companion and wedding planning partner, taking over the role I'd always assumed would be shared between Sarah and me, honoring her mother's memory. The exclusion was systematic and complete. When Sarah got a promotion at work, the promotion I'd helped her prepare for, practicing interview questions at my kitchen table until she felt confident. I heard about it 3 days later through a Facebook post. The celebration dinner was with David's family, of course. I wasn't even told it was happening until after the fact. When she had a minor fender bender on her way home from work, David's father was the one who helped her deal with the insurance company and the body shop. I found out about the accident a week later, in passing, when Sarah mentioned needing a rental car. "Why didn't you call me?" I asked. "You know I would have dropped everything to help you." "Oh, Dad, you were probably busy with work," she said, like my availability had ever been a question before. David's dad handles this kind of stuff all the time. It was easier. Easier. That word became the explanation for everything. It was easier to get career advice from David's father than to maintain our regular coffee dates where we'd talk about her future. It was easier to go shopping with David's mother than to continue our tradition of browsing antique stores together on Saturday afternoons. It was easier to celebrate holidays at David's family's house than to continue the traditions we'd built in the years since her mother died. I used to be the first person she called for everything. Good news, bad news, random thoughts in the middle of the day. Now I was learning about major events in her life through social media, like I was just another acquaintance who happened to follow her online. The most painful moment came when Sarah casually mentioned that David's parents were helping them look for a house. She was excited, talking about how Dad, David's father, was really good at spotting potential problems in older homes, how he'd taught her what to look for in terms of foundation issues and electrical problems. I'd been a contractor for 30 years. I'd taught Sarah everything she knew about construction, about what makes a house solid and safe. I'd been the one to explain the difference between load-bearing and decorative beams, the one who'd shown her how to identify water damage and structural issues. But now she was talking about David's father like he was the expert, like my 30 years of experience meant nothing compared to his casual knowledge of real estate. I could help you look at houses, I offered, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. You know I've been doing this kind of work my whole life. Oh, that's okay, Dad, she said, dismissing my offer with a smile. We've got it covered. We. They had it covered. I wasn't part of the we anymore. I started to understand that this wasn't about David's family being more involved in Sarah's life. This was about me being systematically replaced in every role I'd held as her father. Career advisor, home improvement consultant, emergency contact, celebration companion. Every function I'd served in Sarah's life was being transferred to David or his family. And Sarah either didn't notice it was happening, or she didn't care enough to stop it. The woman I'd raised to be strong and independent was letting someone else make decisions about who belonged in her life and who didn't. She was letting David's family become her family, while the man who'd actually raised her became an increasingly distant memory. The worst part was how natural she made it all seem, like this was just the normal progression of a young woman growing up and getting married, like it was perfectly reasonable for a daughter to gradually phase out her father in favor of her new in-laws, like 28 years of love and sacrifice and shared history could be replaced by 8 months of someone else's attention. But I knew better. I knew this wasn't normal, wasn't healthy, wasn't right. I just didn't know how to fight it without looking like the possessive, overbearing father that David was probably already painting me as. So I watched and waited and hoped that Sarah would eventually realize what she was losing. She never did. 3 weeks before the wedding, Sarah called and asked if we could have dinner, just the two of us. Those words, just the two of us, gave me more hope than I'd felt in months. Maybe she'd finally realized how distant we'd become. Maybe she wanted to repair things before her big day. Maybe she missed the relationship we used to have as much as I did. I suggested Tony's, our old favorite Italian restaurant where we'd celebrated every birthday and achievement since she was 13. The same restaurant where she'd told me about getting into college, where we'd toasted her first job, where we'd shared countless meals and conversations over the years. If we were going to reconnect, it felt right to do it somewhere that held so many good memories. But when I arrived, David was there too. He was sitting next to Sarah in the booth we used to think of as ours, his arm draped casually across the back of her seat like he owned the space. Sarah looked up when she saw me, and I could see the guilt in her eyes before she even spoke. I hope you don't mind, she said, not quite meeting my gaze. David wanted to be here for this conversation. That's when I knew something was terribly wrong. We ordered our meals. Sarah got the chicken parmesan she'd been ordering since she was a teenager, but she barely touched it. David made small talk about the weather, about traffic, about anything except whatever conversation I'd apparently been summoned to have. I could feel the tension building with every passing minute. Sarah kept glancing at David like she was waiting for permission to speak. David kept checking his watch like he had somewhere more important to be, and I sat there, increasingly confused and worried, trying to figure out what was happening. Finally, David cleared his throat and took Sarah's hand in a gesture that seemed more possessive than affectionate. We need to talk about some boundaries, he said, his voice taking on the tone he probably used in business meetings. Professional, detached, like he was delivering a presentation rather than talking to his future father-in-law. Sarah and I have been discussing our future, he continued, and we feel like there needs to be some space for our marriage to grow. The way he said our marriage made it sound like I was somehow threatening it just by existing, like my presence in Sarah's life was an obstacle to their happiness rather than a source of love and support. Sarah finally spoke, but she was looking at David, not me, like she needed his approval for every word. Dad, you've been A lot lately, she said, and each word felt like a small knife in my chest. The constant advice about the wedding, the phone calls, showing up unannounced. I wanted to interrupt, to defend myself, but the hurt was too sharp to speak around. Constant advice? I'd offered suggestions that were politely dismissed. Phone calls? I'd been calling less and less because she never seemed to have time to talk. Showing up unannounced? I'd stopped by twice in the past month, both times because I was in the neighborhood and wanted to see how she was doing. These were normal father behaviors. This was how I'd always been with Sarah, and she'd never complained before. If anything, she used to tease me for not calling enough, for being too independent, for not asking for her help with things around the house. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange and hollow in my own ears. David answered for her, his tone patient but firm, like he was explaining something to a child. "We think it would be best if you took a step back after the wedding. Let Sarah and me establish our own traditions without interference." Interference. The word hit me like a physical blow. Everything I'd done out of love, every attempt to stay connected to my daughter, every effort to be supportive and involved, all of it had been reframed as interference, as something harmful rather than helpful, as something they needed to be protected from. I looked at Sarah, waiting for her to correct him, to tell him that he was wrong, that I wasn't interfering, that I was just being her father. Instead, she reached across the table and briefly touched my hand. "It's not forever, Dad," she said, and her voice was so gentle it somehow made everything worse. "We just need some time to figure out who we are as a married couple." But I could hear in her voice that this wasn't her idea. These weren't her words. The Sarah I'd raised would never have described my love as interference. The Sarah I'd raised would never have needed space from the man who'd devoted his entire adult life to making sure she felt supported and secure. This was David's plan, and somehow he'd convinced my daughter that loving her father was incompatible with loving her husband, that she had to choose between the man who'd raised her and the man she was marrying, and she was choosing him. "How long is some time?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. David and Sarah exchanged a look, one of those married couple glances that somehow excluded everyone else in the room, even though they weren't even married yet. "We'll play it by ear," David said. "See how things go." Which meant indefinitely, which meant they would decide when, if ever, I would be allowed back into my daughter's life. My role as her father was being put on hold while they figured out how to be married without me getting in the way. I sat there for another 10 minutes, picking at food I couldn't taste, listening to David explain how this was really for everyone's benefit, how it would give me time to develop my own interests, my own social life, my own identity outside of being Sarah's father. Like being her father was some kind of unhealthy obsession rather than the most important job I'd ever had. Sarah said very little during the rest of dinner. She nodded when David spoke, agreed when he outlined their boundaries, apologized for any discomfort this might cause me, but she wouldn't look at me directly, and I could see the conflict in her face, the part of her that knew this was wrong, warring with whatever David had convinced her was necessary. When we left the restaurant, Sarah hugged me longer than usual, like she knew it might be the last time for a while. "I love you, Dad," she whispered against my shoulder. "You know that, right?" But love without access isn't really love at all. Love without contact becomes just a memory. And as I watched them walk away together, David's hand possessively on Sarah's back, guiding her toward their car and their future that apparently didn't have room for me, I realized that I wasn't just losing my daughter to marriage. I was losing her to someone who had systematically convinced her that I was the problem in her life. Someone who had taken every normal expression of fatherly love and twisted it into something toxic and controlling. Someone who had made my daughter choose between her past and her future, knowing she would choose him. And the most devastating part? He'd been right. Walking Sarah down the aisle should have been the proudest moment of my life. I'd dreamed about it for 28 years, imagined it countless times. My little girl, beautiful in white, trusting me to deliver her safely to the start of her new life. I thought it would be a quietest moment of pure joy, the culmination of everything I'd worked for as her father. Instead, it felt like I was delivering her to someone who was taking her away from me permanently. Sarah looked radiant that day. There's no denying that. Her dress was stunning, her smile was bright, and she glowed with the kind of happiness that every father wants to see in his daughter. But when she took my arm at the back of the church, there was something different about the way she held herself. A formality that hadn't been there during our practice walk the night before. We weren't father and daughter sharing a sacred moment. We were just following the expected script, playing our assigned roles in David's perfectly orchestrated production. The walk down the aisle felt endless and far too short at the same time. With each step, I was acutely aware that I was walking toward the end of something precious, that in just a few minutes I would hand Sarah over to David and then, what, sit quietly in the front row while they built a life that didn't include me? I tried to focus on the moment, to memorize the feeling of my daughter's hand on my arm, the rustle of her dress, the way the afternoon light caught the lace details I'd helped pay for. But all I could think about was how this felt more like a goodbye than a celebration. When we reached the altar, the pastor asked the traditional question, "Who gives this woman to be married?" I said the words I'd practiced. "Her mother and I do." But they felt hollow in my mouth. I wasn't giving Sarah away to start a new chapter of her life. I was being dismissed from the story entirely. Sarah turned to hug me before taking David's hand, and for just a second, I saw the little girl who used to climb into my lap when thunderstorms scared her. The teenager who'd cried on my shoulder when boys broke her heart. The young woman who'd called me her hero in her college graduation speech. But then she stepped away, took David's outstretched hand, and became someone else entirely. Someone who belonged to him more than to me, one whose future had been planned without any input from the man who'd shaped her past. The ceremony itself was beautiful. I'll give David credit for that. Everything was perfectly coordinated, from the flowers to the music to the lighting. It looked exactly like the weddings you see in magazines, flawless and elegant and completely impersonal. But I felt like I was watching it from outside, like I was already being written out of the story. The vows David and Sarah exchanged were their own, romantic and modern and full of promises about their future together. There was no mention of family, no acknowledgement of the people who'd helped shape them into who they were. It was like their lives had begun the day they met each other. During the reception, I tried my best to play the role of proud father. I smiled for photos, shook hands with David's relatives, made small talk with guests I'd never met before. But everything felt orchestrated to minimize my presence while maximizing David's family's importance. The seating arrangement placed me at a table with Sarah's elderly great-aunts and some distant cousins, while David's family sat at the head table with the bride and groom. When people asked about Sarah's mother, I found myself explaining her absence to strangers while David's mother held court at the center of attention, basking in her role as mother of the groom. The father-daughter dance had been shortened, just 2 minutes instead of the full song, to make room for a longer mother-son dance between David and his mother. When Sarah and I took the floor, she was polite but distant, going through the motions rather than enjoying the moment we'd both been anticipating for years. "Are you happy, sweetheart?" I asked as we swayed to the generic contemporary song David had chosen. "Of course, Dad," she said, but she was looking over my shoulder at David, who was walking us from the edge of the dance floor, with an expression I couldn't quite read. "This is the happiest day of my life." But she didn't sound happy. She sounded like she was reciting lines from a script. When it came time for speeches, I'd prepared something heartfelt. I wanted to tell stories about Sarah growing up, about the little girl who used to help me fix things around the house, who'd made me Father's Day cards every year until she was in college, who'd held my hand at her mother's funeral and promised we'd always take care of each other. But as I stood there looking at their faces, Sarah anxious, David barely tolerating my presence, I realized that those stories weren't welcome here. David had never intended to join our family. He'd intended to extract Sarah from it, and sharing our history would only remind everyone of what was being lost. So I kept my speech short and generic. I talked about love and happiness and bright futures, the kind of safe platitudes that couldn't offend anyone or reveal too much about the relationship that was being severed. I didn't tell the stories I'd planned to tell. I didn't mention teaching Sarah to drive, or helping her through algebra, or the 1,000 little moments that had made us who we were together. Those memories suddenly felt too precious to share with people who were already trying to erase them. The applause was polite when I finished, and I sat down quickly, aware that I'd disappointed people who'd expected more emotional, more personal, more revealing. But David looked relieved, and Sarah looked grateful, and I realized that my restraint was exactly what they'd been hoping for. As the evening wore on, I found myself increasingly invisible. Guests who wanted to congratulate the bride's family gravitated toward David's parents, who were charming and social and clearly comfortable being the center of attention. I was introduced as Sarah's father when necessary, but mostly I was just another guest at a wedding that had very little to do with the daughter I'd raised. When it came time for the final dance, Sarah and David held each other like they were the only people in the room. They looked perfect together, young and beautiful, and completely absorbed in each other. And I realized that this was how it was supposed to be. A bride and groom starting their new life together, ready to create their own traditions and their own family. The problem was that David had decided their new family couldn't coexist with their old one, at least not with me. As the evening ended and guests began to leave, Sarah found me near the coat check. She hugged me tightly, longer than she had all day. "Thank you for everything, Dad," she whispered. "For the wedding, for raising me, for everything." It felt like a goodbye, not a see you later, like she was thanking me for my service as her father and releasing me from the job. "I love you, sweetheart," I said, holding her as long as I could. "You know that, right? No matter what happens, I love you." She pulled back and looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I know, Dad. I love you too." But as I watched her walk back to David, who was waiting impatiently by the exit, I knew that love wasn't going to be enough. Love without access becomes just a memory. And David had made sure that memories were all I was going to have left of my daughter. The wedding day that should have been perfect became the day I lost Sarah forever. Not to marriage. Marriage was supposed to add to our family, not subtract from it. I lost her to someone who had convinced her that loving her father was incompatible with loving her husband, and she'd chosen him without looking back. The first month after the wedding, I respected their request for space. I didn't call, didn't text, didn't drive by their new apartment to see how they were settling in. I told myself this was temporary, that Sarah just needed time to adjust to married life, that she would reach out when she was ready. But weeks turned into months, and my phone stayed silent. I started small, testing the waters carefully. A text message congratulating Sarah on a work project I saw mentioned on her LinkedIn profile. Just a simple, "Saw the news about your promotion. So proud of you," with a heart emoji. I stared at my phone for hours afterward, waiting for the response that never came. Not even a simple "thank you." I sent a card for their 1-month anniversary with a gift certificate to the Italian restaurant where we used to have our father-daughter dinners. I thought maybe they could start a new tradition there, and maybe someday Sarah would remember the good times we'd had in that same booth. I never heard if they received it. The gift certificate was never used. When Sarah's birthday came around in October, I called and left a voicemail singing "Happy Birthday," the way I had every year since she was born. My voice cracked halfway through the song, but I finished it anyway, adding a message about how much I loved her and how I hoped she was happy. She didn't call back. The isolation was crushing, but somehow worse was watching Sarah's life continue without me through social media. Her Instagram was full of photos that felt like glimpses into a world I was no longer allowed to enter. Dinners with David's family, weekend trips to David's parents' lake house, holiday celebrations where my absence was so complete it was like I'd never existed at all. In November, there were photos of Sarah and David's mother shopping for Thanksgiving decorations, laughing over coffee like they were old friends. Sarah looked relaxed and happy in a way I hadn't seen her look in months when she was around me. David's father had helped them set up their new apartment, teaching Sarah how to use their fancy new sound system and mount their flat-screen TV. All the things I used to help her with, all the way. Yes, I used to be useful in her life. I was seeing my daughter's life in glimpses, like watching a movie about someone who looked like her but wasn't really her. The Sarah in these photos had a different family, different traditions, different people to turn to for help and advice and companionship. The Sarah in these photos didn't seem to be missing anything, or anyone. I tried reaching out to mutual friends, hoping someone could help me understand what I'd done wrong. Sarah's college roommate was polite but evasive. Her coworkers made excuses about being too busy to meet for coffee. Everyone gave me the same uncomfortable responses. "I'm sure she's just busy with married life," or, "You know how it is with newlyweds." But I didn't know how it was with newlyweds. When Sarah's mother and I got married, we'd made an effort to stay close to both sets of parents. We'd included them in our holidays, asked for their advice, made sure they felt valued and loved. Marriage had added to our family circle, not subtracted from it. No one wanted to acknowledge what was really happening, that a daughter had simply erased her father from her life. It was easier to pretend this was normal than to confront the reality that something was deeply wrong. The hardest part was the holidays. Thanksgiving came and went without a word from Sarah. I spent it alone, eating a turkey sandwich and watching football, surrounded by the decorations Sarah and I had put up together every year since her mother died. The pilgrim centerpiece she'd made in third grade. The thankful banner we'd created together when she was in high school, each letter decorated with something we were grateful for that year. All of it felt like archaeological evidence of a relationship that no longer existed. Christmas was even worse. I sat alone in the house where Sarah had opened presents for 28 years, surrounded by decorations that now felt like monuments to memories no one else seemed to remember. I'd bought her gifts. Anyway, a necklace I'd seen her admire months ago, a book by her favorite author, a framed photo of her and her mother from when she was little. They sat under my tree, wrapped in paper she'd never see, while Sarah was probably opening gifts at David's parents' house, creating new Christmas memories with people who'd known her for less than 2 years. I drove by their apartment on New Year's Eve, telling myself I was just in the neighborhood, just curious about how they were doing. The lights were on, and through their front window, I could see Sarah and David hosting a party. David's friends, David's family, people I didn't recognize laughing and celebrating while my daughter played hostess in a life that had no room for me. She looked happy. That was the worst part. She genuinely looked happy. Not like someone who was missing an important person in her life. Not like someone who was struggling with the decision to cut her father out of her world. She looked like someone who had moved on completely, who had found something better to replace what she'd lost. Or maybe she didn't see it as a loss at all. Maybe David had convinced her that she was better off without me, that her life was fuller and richer and more meaningful without the burden of maintaining a relationship with her father. By New Year's Eve, I realized that the temporary space Sarah had asked for was never meant to be temporary. This wasn't a cooling off period or an adjustment phase. This was my new reality, a father without a daughter, watching her life from the outside like a stranger who happened to share her DNA. I thought about all the years I'd spent worrying about Sarah's safety, about whether she was eating enough, sleeping enough, making good choices. I'd worried about her driving in bad weather, about her walking alone at night, about her heart getting broken by boys who didn't deserve her. But I'd never worried about losing her to someone who would make her choose between her past and her future. I'd never imagined that the greatest threat to our relationship would come from someone who claimed to love her, someone who was supposed to become part of our family rather than replace it entirely. The silence stretched on, week after week, until I stopped expecting it to end, until I stopped jumping every time my phone rang, hoping it would be Sarah's voice on the other end. Until I stopped checking her social media obsessively, torturing myself with images of the life she was living without me. I was learning what it meant to be a father in exile, to love someone completely while being completely shut out of their life, to carry 28 years of memories that apparently meant nothing to the person who'd shared them with me. The silence said everything I needed to know about where I stood in Sarah's new world. I was no longer necessary, no longer wanted, no longer welcome. I was just someone who used to matter, someone whose role had been filled by people David deemed more suitable. And Sarah was letting it happen. 6 months into the silence, I ran into Jessica, Sarah's college roommate, at the grocery store. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I was picking up ingredients for dinner, just for one, like I'd been doing for months now, when I heard someone call my name. "Mr. Peterson?" I turned around to see Jessica pushing a cart full of baby supplies. She'd gotten married the year before Sarah, and I remembered Sarah being excited about being a bridesmaid. Now Jessica looked uncomfortable when she saw me, like she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. "Jessica," I said, trying to sound normal despite the way my heart had started pounding. "How are you? How's married life treating you?" We made awkward small talk for a few minutes. She told me about her new job, her husband's promotion, the house they'd just bought. I asked about the baby supplies in her cart, and she blushed and told me they were expecting their first child in the fall. "That's wonderful," I said, and I meant it. "Sarah must be so excited for you." Jessica's expression changed immediately, and I knew I'd said something wrong. "Actually," she said, glancing around like she was worried someone might overhear, Sarah and I haven't really been talking much lately. Oh, I said, though I wasn't entirely surprised. If Sarah had cut me out of her life, it made sense that other relationships might be casualties too. Jessica shifted uncomfortably, clearly debating whether to say more. Finally, she seemed to make a decision. Mr. Peterson, can I ask you something? What happened between you and Sarah? I mean, I know it's none of my business, but I honestly don't know, I said, and hearing myself admit it out loud made it feel even more pathetic. David thought I was too involved in their lives. They asked for space after the wedding, and I gave it to them. But the space seems to be permanent. Jessica looked stricken. Mr. Peterson, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but David's been telling people that you were controlling and manipulative. He says Sarah is better off without your toxic influence. The words hit me like a physical blow. Toxic? Controlling? I'd spent 28 years loving my daughter unconditionally, supporting her dreams, putting her needs before my own. I'd worked 2 jobs to pay for her college. I'd been there for every heartbreak, every triumph, every moment when she needed someone who loved her more than anything in the world. There's more, Jessica continued, her voice getting quieter. David's been going through Sarah's phone, deleting your messages before she sees them. And he told his family, I heard this from Sarah's cousin, who heard it from David's sister, that you tried to break up their engagement because you were jealous of their happiness. Each revelation felt like another knife in my back. David hadn't just isolated Sarah from me. He'd systematically destroyed my reputation to justify it. He'd painted me as the villain in a story where I thought I was the hero, where all I'd ever tried to do was love my daughter well. But surely Sarah doesn't believe that, I said, though even as I said it, I wasn't sure anymore. Jessica looked away, unable to meet my eyes. Sarah's been telling people that she's happier without the pressure of maintaining a relationship with you. She says David helped her realize that your relationship was unhealthy, that you were too dependent on her. I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet. Dependent? I'd raised Sarah to be independent and strong. I'd encouraged her to go away to college, to travel, to build her own life. Yes, I'd loved having her close by after she graduated, but I'd never asked her to limit her choices for my sake. Or had I? Had my desire to stay connected to my daughter somehow become an unhealthy burden? Had my love, which felt so pure and unconditional to me, actually been selfish and demanding? Jessica, I said, I need you to be honest with me. Did Sarah seem unhappy before David? Did she ever complain about me being too involved in her life? Jessica was quiet for a long time, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. Finally, she sighed. No, Mr. Peterson, Sarah used to talk about you all the time. How grateful she was for everything you'd done for her after her mom died. How proud she was to be your daughter. How she hoped someday she could be as good a parent as you were. She paused, then added quietly, but after David, she started talking about things differently. Like maybe she'd been wrong about what healthy relationships looked like. Like maybe she needed to learn how to be independent from you in order to be a good wife. I drove home in a daze, Jessica's words echoing in my head. Every memory I had of raising Sarah, every sacrifice I'd made, every moment of pride and joy, all of it had been rewritten as something sinister and unhealthy. David hadn't just taken my daughter away, he'd convinced her that I was the problem she needed to solve. That night, I sat in Sarah's old bedroom, looking at photos and awards and memories from a childhood that apparently meant nothing to her anymore. Her high school diploma, signed, "Thank you for believing in me, Dad." The Father's Day card she'd made me in college, covered with inside jokes and memories of our adventures together. The photo from her graduation, where she'd called me her hero in front of hundreds of people. Had all of that been fake? Had she been lying when she said those things? Or had David somehow convinced her that her feelings had been wrong, that her gratitude had been misplaced? I realized that David's plan had been perfect in its simplicity. Isolate Sarah gradually, so she wouldn't notice how much distance had grown between us. Replace me in every role I'd held in her life, so she wouldn't feel my absence as acutely. Reframe our history as problematic, so she'd feel justified in walking away. And then let Sarah choose, knowing that someone who's been convinced their past was unhealthy will naturally choose a future that promises to be better. And she'd chosen him, without looking back. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something besides sadness and confusion and desperate hope. I felt angry. Not at Sarah, she was a victim in this too, manipulated by someone who claimed to love her. but at David, who had systematically destroyed a relationship that had never threatened him, never competed with him, never tried to take anything away from him. I'd been willing to share my daughter's love. David had demanded a full of it. And somehow, he'd convinced Sarah that this was what love looked like: exclusive, controlling, demanding that she erase her past in order to deserve her future. He'd convinced her that choosing him meant abandoning me, and that abandoning me was not only acceptable, but necessary for her own well-being. The truth was clear now, even if it had taken me 6 months to see it. David had never intended to join our family. From the very beginning, his goal had been to extract Sarah from it completely, and he'd succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. My daughter was gone, replaced by someone who looked like her but had been convinced that everything we'd shared was toxic, everything we'd built was unhealthy, and everything I'd given her was something she needed to escape from. The man I'd thought I knew, the charming, confident man who'd shaken my hand and promised to take care of my daughter, had been playing a long game that I never even realized was happening, and I'd lost. I spent 3 more months in that fog of grief and anger before something finally shifted inside me. It happened on a Tuesday morning in March, almost a year after Sarah's engagement, when I was going through old paperwork and found a folder I'd forgotten about. Inside were all the receipts from Sarah's wedding, everything I'd paid for to make her day perfect. The wedding dress, $3,200. The flowers for the ceremony, $800. The photographer, $20,500. Line item after line item of expenses I'd happily covered because I wanted Sarah to have everything she dreamed of. But at the bottom of the pile was a receipt that stopped me cold. Dance lessons at Arthur Murray's studio, $240. 6 weeks of private instruction so I could surprise Sarah with moves that would make her laugh during our father-daughter dance. I'd practiced for hours, imagining the moment when she'd realize I'd learned how to dip her propa early, how to spin her without getting our feet tangled. All for a 2-minute dance to a song that wasn't even the one she'd promised to dance with me to when she was little. I sat there holding that receipt, remembering how excited I'd been to surprise her, how I'd practiced the steps in my living room every night after work, how I'd imagined her face lighting up with delight when she realized her old dad had learned some new tricks just for her. That's when I realized I'd been mourning the loss of someone who was already gone. The Sarah who had asked me to step back, who had let David rewrite our history, who had chosen silence over love. That wasn't the daughter I'd raised. That was someone else entirely. Someone David had helped create by convincing her that everything good between us had actually been harmful. I made a decision that day. I wrote Sarah one final letter, not begging or pleading, but simply telling her the truth about what I saw happening and what I hoped she might remember someday. I told her that I loved her and would always be here if she ever wanted to come home. I told her about the difference between the man I thought David was and the man he'd proven himself to be. I told her that healthy relationships don't require you to abandon the people who loved you first, that marriage should add to your life rather than subtract from it. I wrote about the little girl who used to help me fix things around the house, who made me Father's Day cards every year until she was in college, who held my hand at her mother's funeral and promised we'd always take care of each other. I reminded her of the woman who'd called me her hero at graduation, who'd thanked me for believing in her, who'd once told me I was the best father she could have asked for. And I told her that when she was ready to remember who she used to be, I'd be waiting. But I also told her something else, something that was harder to write but necessary for both of us to hear. I told her that I wouldn't wait forever in silence, that I was going to start living my life again, building new relationships, creating new memories, that I was going to stop being defined by her absence and start being defined by my own choices. I mailed the letter on a Wednesday and then did something I hadn't done in months. I called my brother Tom and made plans for dinner. We'd grown apart over the years, both of us busy with our own families and responsibilities. But when I told him what had happened with Sarah, he was quiet for a long moment before saying, "I wondered why we hadn't seen you two together lately." That dinner led to weekly dinners, which led to Tom introducing me to his neighbor Carol, whose husband had passed away 2 years earlier. Carol and I started as friends, 2 people who understood loss in different ways, but slowly became something more. I started volunteering at the community center, teaching kids how to build birdhouses and repair bicycles, sharing the skills I'd once tried to pass on to Sarah. Those kids reminded me that being good at loving children wasn't something toxic or unhealthy. It was a gift that could help heal some of the wounds in the world. For the first time in months, I had things to look forward to. Not because I was trying to replace Sarah or forget about her, but because I was finally remembering that I existed as more than just her father. I was a whole person with interests and talents and love to give, even if my daughter no longer wanted to receive it. 6 months after I mailed that letter, on a rainy Thursday evening in September, my phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I thought I was imagining it. I almost didn't answer. I'd grown so accustomed to silence that the sound of her ringtone felt like something from another lifetime. Dad? Her voice was different than I remembered. Smaller, broken, desperate. Hi, sweetheart, I said, and the word came so natural. It was like no time had passed at all. She was crying. Dad, I'm so sorry. I made such terrible mistakes. David left me for someone else, and I don't know what to do. I don't know who I am anymore. Part of me, the father part that had never stopped loving her, wanted to rush over immediately and fix everything, to pretend none of this had ever happened, to comfort her and protect her and make all the hurt go away like I'd done when she was little. But I'd learned something important during those months of silence, something that would have been impossible to understand before I'd been forced to rebuild my own identity. Love without respect isn't really love at all. I love you, Sarah, I said, and I meant it completely. I have always loved you, and I always will, but you hurt me deeply. You allowed someone to convince you that everything we shared was wrong, and you walked away from me without looking back. She cried harder. I know, Dad, I know I did. I was so confused, and David was so sure about everything. He made it seem like choosing him meant I had to reject you, like I couldn't be a good wife if I was still Daddy's little girl. Being someone's daughter isn't something you outgrow, I told her. It's not something healthy partners ask you to give up. We talked for 2 hours that night. Sarah told me how David had isolated her from all her old friends, not just me, how he'd criticized everything about her past, convinced her that she needed to become a completely different person to deserve his love, how he'd controlled her finances, her social media, even her choice of clothes, all while making her believe that this was what mature, committed relationships looked like. I lost myself completely, she said, and when he left, I realized I didn't even know who I was anymore. I don't have any friends left, Dad. I don't have any life left that isn't connected to him. It broke my heart to hear it, but it also made me proud that she was finally able to see what had happened to her. That took courage, and courage had always been one of Sarah's best qualities, even when David had convinced her to hide it. But I also told her something that was hard for both of us to hear. Earning back my trust would take time. Rebuilding our relationship would require her to acknowledge not just what David had done to her, but what she had allowed to happen to us. She'd chosen David over me once, based on his manipulation and lies. Now she needed to choose differently, not because she was hurt and alone, but because she genuinely wanted her father back in her life. I understand, she said. I know I have to prove that I mean it this time. I know I have to show you that I remember who we used to be together. That was 8 months ago. We're talking now, slowly rebuilding what David tried to destroy. Sarah is in therapy, working to understand how she got so lost and how to make sure it never happens again. She's rebuilding friendships, rediscovering interests David had convinced her to abandon, learning to trust her own judgment again. And I'm learning too. Learning that sometimes the people who love you most can hurt you deepest, and that protecting yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. Learning that being a good father sometimes means refusing to accept being treated poorly, even by your own child. Most importantly, I learned that I am more than just Sarah's father. I'm a whole person with value that exists beyond any single relationship. David tried to erase me, and for a while I let him, but I'm still here, and I'm still writing my own story. Sarah and I will probably never have exactly the same relationship we had before David. Too much has happened, too much trust was broken, too many words were said that can't be taken back, but we're building something new, something based on mutual respect rather than just unconditional love. And maybe that's healthier for both of us. Maybe I needed to learn that loving someone doesn't mean accepting whatever treatment they're willing to give you. Maybe Sarah needed to learn that real love doesn't ask you to erase your past to deserve your future. We're different people now, both of us. But we're still father and daughter, and some bonds are stronger than the people who try to break them. Even when one of those people is the person you love most in the world,